In this nugget, we're going to analyse the language, structure and form of the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. In the exam, you'll get a question related to the theme of power and conflict, so you need to understand how these themes are explored in each of the poems in your anthology. However, the words power and conflict might not actually appear in the question, so you need to know words or synonyms that relate to these themes. We're going to look at some words relating to power that might appear in the question. These words might also give you ideas for the topic of your paragraphs. Words you might see relating to power include confidence, arrogance, and hubris, powerlessness, vulnerability and weakness, control and dominance, and authority and tyranny. The words you might see relating to conflict include tension and arguments, war, fighting and soldiers, confusion and identity crisis, and emotions such as anger, jealousy and grief. So now we're going to think about the themes of power and conflict in the poem. First of all, Tennyson presents the battle as uneven. He shows that the Russians are far more powerful, and so defeat for the British is inevitable. When we talk about an uneven battle, we mean that one side is more powerful than the other. In the poem, Tennyson presents soldiers as heroic, and he presents war as noble. Remember, the word soldier, meaning those that fight in conflict, is one of those synonyms that might appear in the question instead of the words power or conflict. Finally, Tennyson hides the realities of the war. He romanticizes the violence and hides the suffering. Again, violence, a result of war and conflict, is another word you might see in the question. When we say that Tennyson romanticizes the war, when you romanticize something, you make it seem better than it is, so he's hiding the reality of the war. One of the first things to consider about a poem is its narrative perspective. Writing about narrative perspective will get you marks for structural analysis. Narrative perspective is the viewpoint that a story is told from. The poem was written by Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was Poet Laureate at the time. As Poet Laureate, Tennyson had to reflect the national mood, so the poem's told from the perspective of the people who admired the soldiers' bravery. The first interpretation that we're going to explore is the idea that Tennyson presents the battle as uneven. He presents the Russian forces as far more powerful than the British army, and so defeat for the British is presented as inevitable. An excellent quote to support this point is "Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them." In this quote, Tennyson's use of anaphora creates a sense of relentless cannon fire. Remember, anaphora is when you repeat the first part of the sentence in successive clauses. Here, the word cannon is repeated at the beginning of each sentence. The word cannon appears throughout the stanza, emphasizing how the British soldiers were surrounded, which makes the defeat seem inevitable. We're now going to look at a further 3 quotes that support this interpretation that Tennyson presents the battle as uneven: the mouth of death, the valley of death, and the jaws of death. Tennyson creates imagery of the valley as a place of death to reflect the inevitability of the British forces' defeat. They know they will not all come out of the valley alive. Death is even personified. Personification is when a writer gives human characteristics to something non-human. So death is personified as having a mouth and having jaws, and this creates a monstrous image and creates the impression of the horror and the terror that the soldiers must have felt as they rode towards the enemy forces. Now we're going to explore a new interpretation, that Tennyson presents soldiers as heroes and presents war as noble. And we're going to do this by looking at the quote, "Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air." Here, Tennyson repeats the image of their flashing sabres, their swords. He creates an image of their sabres being held up ready for attack. and glinting or flashing in the sunlight. This association with light carries connotations of goodness, once again suggesting the soldiers are heroes or heroic. Tennyson romanticizes their courage and their skill in battle. When you romanticize something, you make it seem better than it is. Furthermore, he presents the soldiers as heroic when he says, "Boldly they rode, and hero fell," and describes them as noble 600. Throughout the poem, Tennyson uses this language of praise and admiration to describe the soldiers. He refers to the soldiers' bold or brave actions, and he praises them as noble men. Tennyson deliberately uses emotive language to encourage patriotic pride in the reader. In some ways, the description of the British soldiers as heroic and the war as noble could be argued to be a form of propaganda, because he's manipulating the reader's emotions and their view of the war. To be patriotic is to feel proud of one's country, and Tennyson is making the reader feel patriotic pride in the soldiers. Propaganda is information that twists the truth in order to manipulate people. Furthermore, Tennyson hides the reality of the war, and he romanticizes the violence and hides the suffering of the soldiers. For instance, when he describes that horse and hero fell and talks about the valley of death, he's using euphemisms. Unlike other poets, such as Wilfred Owen, in Exposure, Tennyson wants to hide the suffering of the soldiers rather than expose the realities of the war, and therefore he only references death through euphemisms. To euphemize is to make something seem less serious than it really is. And a euphemism is a word or phrase that hides the importance or serious nature of something. So when he talks about the heroes falling, this sounds gentle and painless, but it's actually describing their death. And that's why when he describes the battlefield, he uses an image from the Bible. He describes it as the valley of death, and this suggests there's something glorious about their dying. What he doesn't do is clearly describe suffering and pain. Tennyson's final message in the poem is to present the soldiers as heroic and to present the war as noble. You can see this message very clearly in the final stanza. "When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. In this final stanza, Tennyson uses the imperative verb honour twice. An imperative verb is a bossy or a commanding verb. They tell people what to do. The use of honour twice is also an example of anaphora, which is when you repeat the first part of the sentence in successive clauses. By using anaphora and imperative verbs, the narrator commands the reader to honour, to respect and admire the soldier's sacrifice. In the final line of the poem, the narrator describes the soldiers as the noble 600. The adjective noble reveals Tennyson's patriotic stance and his focus on the bravery of the soldiers. In this poem, Tennyson glorifies war, suggesting that soldiers who die in battle become heroes, who should live on in the public's memory.